Good morning, good morning, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the 2022 CDBG-CV conference. We're glad that you're here with us this morning. And so today we're going to be going down the pathway regarding economic development. And my name is Deidre Coles. I'm with Capital Access, and I'm joined today by the very illustrious, great presenter, Dion Roberts from TDA, and we will be tag teaming today in providing this information to you. We thank you so much for being here and being attentive. So we're going to just jump right on in. I believe that all of the housekeeping should have been taken care of. Make sure everybody has their coffee. You know, it is early in the morning. So let's go. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about economic development and what some of the eligible activities are under this designation with the CDBG-CV dollars. And so it can be utilized for special economic development activities. We're going to go into that, explain and identify what that means. It can be used for micro enterprise activities. We'll be discussing that as well. Commercial rehabilitation has been a huge one, especially amid this pandemic that we're still in. Job training, technical assistance for businesses. And we're going to talk about CBDO, that is community-based development organizations, not to be confused with CHDO, which we intimately call CHODO, and that is related to the home program. So there is a distinguishment because we are talking about economic development activities. So just want to make sure that we stay clear. You'll see on your slide as well, there are the references, the regulatory references, so that you can go and be able to do some additional research and you know where the citations are exactly. So now we're going to talk about this special economic development activity. You say, well, what makes it special, Deidre? Well, it's special because it can provide direct assistance to for-profit businesses as long as they meet national objectives. And then there's a two-part test. We'll talk about that in just a second. So some of those activities under special economic development is the acquisition, construction, possibly rehabilitation, reconstruct of commercial buildings. So anything in that corridor or equipment, being able to utilize the dollars for that, any of those acquisition, construction-based activities. I mentioned in the onset about being able to provide assistance to for-profit businesses. That's pretty big and very useful. And then economic development in connection with other type of activities. And we're just going to tempt you just a little bit with that, but we're going to go into that further as well. So when we're looking at special economic development, it can be provided in multiple ways. It can be a grant, it can be a loan, it can be a guarantee, and that's related to the HUD 108 program. And it can also provide technical assistance and support services. And that would be all of benefit to a nonprofit and or a for-profit. Now, they have to make sure that it meets a national objective in order for it to be eligible. And it also depends where that business is located within your geographic area. Now, the one thing about this, about making sure that it meets a national objective, but there's also a two-part test related to this. One is that, especially when we're talking about for-profits, needs to make sure that it is an eligible activity, right? So what exactly are they doing? Is it acquisition? Is it rehab? Is it purchasing equipment, operating capital? What exactly is that? And then there's also a public benefit requirement. And Dion will talk about that a little bit later, but make sure that you pay special attention for that. So now let's talk about, though, a little bit more about the for-profit. Now, of course, there was a lot of job loss. There were closures based on the pandemic. So the intent of the Special Economic Development Fund would be to help offset or prevent the job loss, so that they don't have to close. It helps to establish or either expand a business so that they can provide medical supplies or other goods and services, for the purpose of infectious disease response. So, and that has been established, these somewhat of a conversion, right, of a building so that individuals can come get their PPE, materials to remain safe, or it might be testing site, things of that sort. And then there's also the conversion so that it can produce the supplies also. And by doing that and and converting and expanding what the businesses do, well, guess what else it does? It helps to create or retain jobs. And that's what economic development is all about. So that is a fantastic opportunity to be able to be very responsive within our respective communities. Now, once again, you're going to hear this, and it's going to be repeated several times when we go through the different activities in which economic development can be used. But you're going to see grants, loans, and loan guarantees. You're going to hear that several times. And it just helps us retain in our minds that as we are looking at projects and we're looking to deploy ways that to utilize the CDBG-CV dollars within our communities, we have some options, right? We've got some tools in our toolkit. We've got some different methodologies that could work for the services that we are going to be providing in the community. So what happened? On April 30th, 2021, there was guidance that was provided. Part of the whole situation is that any activity that is going to be done, it needs to be able to be tied back to coronavirus, right? So you're going to see some the approaches to PPR tieback. Well, you probably have heard that utilized already in other sessions, but just in case you missed it, make sure you write that down. The PPR is prepare for, prevent, and respond to the coronavirus. So PPR tieback. So we want to make sure that there's a linkage to the activity, the eligible activity that we're going to utilize the economic development dollars for. But also we want to make sure that it ties back to the reason why we are utilizing these funds. So it provides a clear opportunity and a clear pathway for compliance. That's a huge thing as well. So what when we're looking at that in special economic development or in economic development using CDBG, we want to make sure that one of the things is job retention, right? Job creation and job retention. So it might be providing working capital to smaller businesses, and the smaller businesses and the enabling and the creation or retention of those jobs so that they don't have to lay the individuals off, so that working capital could go toward, salaries. It may be for the rent so that the unit or the business stays open. Utilities, working capital, things. When we're talking about that, we're talking about things that keep that business going so that there is not a reduction in or the laying off of employees, nor that the business itself has closed. So this is a way that we can provide grants and loans to support the businesses. Now, it might be for the acquisition, once again, as we said before, the conversion or construction or reconstruction of a commercial space, so that, especially in local economies that have actually felt the sting of loss based on coronavirus. So it could be, what if it's a cafe? And you want to make sure when we're talking about the acquisition of the conversion, let's just use an example of a cafe. And there may not be, prior to coronavirus, we were all nice and comfortable together. There was that much space in between. It was just enough for the waitress to get in and get out. Well, that, of course, right now we're talking about making sure we're staying a safe distance apart. So some of that construction and conversion could be to retrofit to ensure that there is the business has safety protocols in place. Also with possibly the air exchange. So those are some of the things that economic development, the dollars can be utilized for, and we're going to actually see that again in just a few moments. So moving on to that, we're also wanting to, this is once again, this is redundancy. You're going to hear all of this. The whole intent of economic development also is to not to increase job loss, but to try to avoid it, right? So there's been the social distancing, of course, and the encouragement in some professions earlier on in the coronavirus is staying at home orders, right? And so there was a lot of shifting that businesses and companies had to do. So of course, that means when there's an economic disruption based on this pandemic, then, things such as working capital and being able to retain the jobs of individuals who were already making that were considered to be low, moderate income individuals. We want to make sure that they have a job, they can retain that job, businesses can be retained, and also so that those individuals will be able to make money, right? Have a job, be able to take care of their family. And they can't do that if they don't have a job, right? So once again, there's that linkage there for eligible activities. So we talked a little bit about a micro enterprise organization. Now, a micro enterprise organization is defined as an owners or persons who work toward developing, expanding, or stabilizing a business. So they generally have 5 or fewer employees, okay? Now they want to make sure that we know the difference. This is different from SBA, the Small Business Administration. So under that definition, and I know through coronavirus and they were doing the PPE, the other funding source for small businesses. That definition says that a small business is 10 employees or fewer. Well, let's just want to make sure for the clarity here, we're utilizing not the SBA definition, but the one established by HUD, the HUD definition. So we're looking at an organization with 5 or less, okay? And that could include also the owner in reference to that micro enterprise. Now, what can we help them with? Well, several different things. We're going to go into more of what we can provide under micro enterprise and the way.
Deidre, I believe you're on mute.
That was weird. Thank you, Dion. So we're going to go a little bit further, talk about the different activities that we can undergo under micro enterprise. So we provide under micro enterprise assistance. Assistance can be provided so that that business has TA advice, maybe some business training through business services. And so this gives an organization, a small organization, the support that they need. So it's like capacity building support. That capacity building says, okay, here's my business plan. This is what I'm wanting to do, or this is how I'd like to expand. But they need that additional help from subject matter experts to help them make sure that they're making sound decisions. They're taking consideration several elements in the realm of having a business and operating a business that will be sustained and continue on. So this is a wonderful opportunity to give not a handout, but a hand up to the smaller businesses to help them be viable and strong. Moving on, another eligible activity for micro enterprise is, I talked about it before, you will see once again, you'll see a little bit of redundancy, is to increase their capacity. Once again, we want them to not be here today, gone tomorrow, but more about building the capacity of the organization in the way of they're making sound business decisions, sound investment into the business so that it can continue to thrive as an open business, and of course be able to have jobs there. That small business has an opportunity to create and help retain working individuals. It could be from the community, it could be through some type of job training, and we're actually going to go on a little bit more and we'll talk about that training in just a moment. But the really cool thing about providing economic development assistance to micro enterprises is that there's no public benefit standard. It's not subject to that. So you may have heard, or in some of your other sessions, there may have been discussion about public benefit standards. And Dion's going to walk us through what those are for economic development. But when it comes to, once again, micro enterprise, it doesn't apply. So that is good. And so even though it may not require to meet a public benefit standard, it still has to meet a national objective, though. So that's still to the core of CDBG, is making sure that it meets a national objective. And I believe 2 tracks from now, you all will have a robust conversation and training about national objectives. So definitely look forward to that. So looking at CDBG, establishing, stabilizing, expanding for that micro enterprise in what areas? It could be medical, could be food delivery, cleaning, or some other type of service that helps support the health and safe distancing, quarantine for it could be for the community in which it is situated. It could be for a particular population of individuals, like seniors or something like that. Or it could be the establishment and being able to provide that medical and food delivery for individuals who are less fortunate or they're shut in and don't have any transportation, living in a low income area. So there are so many different ways in which a micro enterprise can really take in and reach in to those communities really in need and be able to help support them, as long as it's going to also help continue and support that micro enterprise small business. I'm going to take a break for a second and Dion has a question that has related to one of our last slides. Dion?
Absolutely. I thought we could cover the question that came in about microenterprise because I know
Oh,
you're getting ready to move on up to other topics.
mm-hmm,
So I'll just read you the question. They're asking, and I think this relates to what qualifies as a microenterprise in terms of
mm-hmm,
size.
mm-hmm.
Um, how do you handle the microenterprise definition and multiple partners slash investors?
Mm. Okay, that's a really interesting question. Thank you very much. So, remembering with the definition of microenterprise, it was five or fewer employees. Now, employee that we're talking about, that is, employee of that organization. But remember, one of the very big things that we do in with CDBG is it encourages partnerships, right? And leveraging. So if we're talking about someone and maybe an investor or a principal a stakeholder in a company, if they're not part of the company and that in the employee and they're getting paid for that, then they wouldn't be. It's kind of like a board or director, so those are partnerships, and that's what helps support the business. But when we're talking about micro enterprise, we're talking about the actual employees that are getting paid under that business.
So just to clarify that, because that's a great point, if an owner is actually working the business,
Mm-hmm.
right, they're not a silent partner or providing a capital loan or something like that as an investor, then they do count, right? Because owners of the business count towards the number. But again, we're not talking about investors who might be providing a capital infusion and who aren't really participating in the business. They're just really acting as lenders, right? So it's an important distinction.
Excellent question. Absolutely excellent question. Okay, so one of the other things I wanted to talk about before we move on to commercial rehabilitation is, one of the things in the second bullet there, it says that the assistance can be provided through loans, tech TA, grants, and other financial assistance. So, what exactly are other financial assistance? Well, that could be other loans and maybe individual development accounts or some other financial support to help with the stabilization and the expansion of that business. So those would be assistance can be provided in various ways when it comes to economic development for micro enterprise organizations. And of course, once again, as we've talked about, it can receive and provide technical assistance. And this is with a micro enterprise, we're not talking about them being situated in a very up and coming, financially stable community. They're normally situated in or located in communities that are being revitalized. And it's part of the fact of whenever you're doing community revitalization, remember you're looking at the social and economic and the housing aspect. You're looking at all these different aspects when a community being revitalized, right? So this is a micro enterprise organization would be there also to help support that revitalization of that community and the local economies that are affected in some cases more in a greater amount affected by coronavirus, and or they may have limited resources in preparing to help prevent for future outbreaks and or the spreading of the pandemic or the disease. So that is about micro enterprise. I want to direct everyone, just want to, let you all know that there's a large amount of resources in reference to the CDBG-CV program. And if you haven't gone and accessed the toolkit for it, you're going to hear about it a little bit later, but there is some wonderful guides that have been created to help each grantee with things to think about, as well as how to accurately deploy assistance to within the community in the form of microenterprise or any other small nonprofit or for-profit organization, inclusive of a quick guide that was there that was written as well on economic development. So we encourage you to access that, and Dion will share that during her portion as well.
So absolutely, I will. Deidre, we have a number of questions right now in the Q&A, and I think a lot of them are actually follow-up to the prior question around how to count owners and investors. So I think they're kind of the hypothetical follow-ons to that.
Okay.
I just wanted to clarify if it would be okay, one portion of that, because I know there's a lot of confusion about how do I decide if they're an owner or an investor and what does that look like?
Please do.
And a good way to think about that is, and the way that HUD has presented it in the past, is that you're counting owners or persons who work toward developing, expanding, or stabilizing a business. And I'm putting that out there because one of the questions asked if it would be based on the fact of whether or not they were being paid. And that's not necessarily how you would determine it, because a lot of times, right, when you're starting a business, you may not be taking a check or getting paid on any kind of regular basis, but you might still be the owner or actively working the business, really trying to make a difference. And so what you want to think about is the difference between an owner participant, somebody who's really working on that business, versus an investor, somebody who's put in money, but really more as a loan and expects to see a return on their investment in that way. So I wanted to clarify that. And then I wanted to ask you for if you wanted to answer a couple others of these, because there's also one asking about whether or not contractors would count towards that number.
Contractors in the realm of they work for the company. You mean
right? So let's say they're not an employee of mine, but I'm contracting out my bookkeeping services because I can't afford to have a bookkeeper on staff. So does that person count?
To be part of the business.
Right. So I think that, again, the
Dion?
distinction is between employees and owners versus a contractor. And very often a contractor has more than one client. Right?
Exactly.
So this business is not necessarily their primary.
Right.
And so in that instance, they don't count.
They don't.
But we're talking about owners and employees who are really actively working the business, either working to expand it, working to stabilize it, especially in these times. Stabilizing is a huge part of that. And then there are a couple others that I think we're going to cover on the next slide. So I'm going to hold those for now, and then maybe we can come back to them.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you so much. So we're going to we're going to start leaving the realm of micro enterprise and talk about that commercial rehabilitation, because that has been also a huge thing that has occurred. A lot of businesses had to put in some, protocols in order to make sure that it's providing for safety, right? So there could be the acquisition, construction, reconstruction, and rehab of a commercial or industrial building, so that or equipment and improvements. So when utilizing the fund CDBG CV for that purpose, it can be several different things. It could be with the HVAC system, with the air exchange. I believe there's already been a track that covered that one, that particular subject. And also could be putting up certain controls so that there is a safe barrier between a customer and then, of course, an employee who has to have an exchange. It could be, there's, if you could dream it, you could probably do it. As long as it, once again, it still meets a national objective. And then also it is subject to a public benefit standard. And so we will definitely go over that a little bit more. But remember, one of the things I want to make sure you understand is that it is still subject to all of the other CDBG rules. So the more, or what I'm speaking of more of, is about the environment, being able to look and make sure that it is compliant with, making sure that we're not disturbing where it's located. So all of those environmental type of protocols would still be in place. So you have to take those under consideration depending on the size of the project. However, if it is a private for-profit owner of a business who is seeking CDBG-CV dollars through economic development, then the rehab is limited to the outside, to the exterior of the building, and corrects code violations. So potentially, if it's a business who is a for-profit, and they want to do some retrofitting on the inside of their business so that there's safety measures. Well, not with CDBG-CV. That would not be eligible and that would not be allowable. So make sure that if it is a for-profit owner, the rehab is limited to the outside or the exterior of the building and corrects a code violation. And then also other improvements that there's a whole list of them under that category, can be carried out under special economic development, and we give the citation. But in reference to a for-profit owner who's getting exterior assistance, getting CDBG-CV for the exterior building only, here's another example or another time in which the public benefit standard does not apply. They are not subject to that. So there are some very particular caveats to providing commercial rehabilitation under CDBG-CV for economic development if it is a for-profit organization. So just wanted to make sure that there's a distinguishment that's there. Now, Dion, I believe we had some questions that may have come up underneath prior for the commercial rehab.
Yeah, there are a couple of questions.
Okay.
So the first one is, does a business owner have to live in the area, or does the business have to be located in the area to use CDBG-CV funds for technical assistance or grants?
Really good question. Thank you so much in reference to that. So as a micro enterprise or just in general?
The question appears to be in general, but you could certainly address it as both.
Okay, fantastic. So, in reference to, does it have to be located? The owner does not have to live within the geographic area. The business and the location of the business, depending on the manner, I would say, or what that business is providing for the community. In order for, if it's a micro, remember, if it's a micro enterprise and it's all about the revitalization of a community, it would stand to reason that the micro enterprise organization is located within a qualified census tract that is LMI. And so based on the micro enterprise, as far as any other organization or any other economic development or economic development and or small business, it does not have to be located within a LMI geographic area.
Right. And that's a great point, because there's another question that sort of speaks to that around national objective, right? Because it doesn't necessarily have to be LMI, but every activity does still have to meet a national objective. And so this person is asking, what are some examples of businesses that meet a national objective if they're not required to be LMI?
What is an example of a business in which it does not have to meet LMI? Is that was, I'm just repeating?
Right. So what are the other, how do I meet a national objective if I'm not LMI?
Okay. So
for example, there might be low mod area, depending upon where they're located, right? It might be low mod jobs. And then, of course, we do always have our good friend urgent need, even though our ability to utilize it is limited by the cap. That is also always an option that can be considered, especially in current circumstances. So that's something to think about as well.
Thank you.
Sure. So here is another question. What about a business that owns vacation rentals? They're asking for mortgage assistance and funding to help stock the home with toiletries, linens, etc., and payroll assistance, but their employees are 1099 employees. Would this be allowable?
It's a small business, and so they're trying to get equipment, so for operation of the business.
Correct.
And supplies. But it's a vacation rental.
And payroll for contract employees.
Right? Okay. All right. So the national objective, we have to look and see what national objective that would come up underneath. And obviously it's not going to be it's not going to be for LMI persons or individuals, because that's not where it's located. That's not what kind of business it is. The next thing is it creating jobs? Well, 1099 is a contract per individual. It's not considered to be an employee of the organization that's there. So I would, and then there's also urgent need. Well, that's not, vacation rentals is not really an urgent need. So there's some questions that need to be reviewed, because on the face value, I'd probably say that it doesn't, but needing to go a little bit deeper into having that conversation in case I've missed something on a one-on-one basis. But right now, I would say that's not a good example.
Yeah, I think that's.
Do we have a different take on that for that analysis?
I think it's a great point. The other thing that I would note is we've been working with a lot of communities to design and launch small business programs, is that very often the communities are determining priorities for what kinds of businesses to fund. So they might be prioritizing storefronts to maintain sort of the economic vibrancy of their downtown, or they might be not funding certain types of businesses. We've seen a lot of limitations around not funding liquor stores or gambling businesses, or other kinds of things. And so part of that is not only determining what is allowable as an eligible activity and what meets a national objective, but also what are the purposes and priorities of the individual program that you're running. Right? So always keeping in mind that HUD's requirements are the foundational requirements, and you can certainly come in from that to more clearly define exactly what the impact is that you're trying to have. So there's a couple of more. How does a HUD opportunity zone affect regulations for economic development? All right. And the good news is it doesn't. Now,
I didn't realize I was still on mute. Sorry.
That's okay. It might provide additional flexibility under its own regulations in terms of funding and opportunities and leveraging, but the regulations specifically for community development block grant activities do not have any waivers or flexibility specific to opportunity zones.
Yeah.
And then here's another, oh, this is a really good one. Can you also use the national objective LMC, so limited clientele, if you're creating, for instance, additional childcare spots for LMI families? That's
a good question. Yeah, definitely. So that's a really good example of being able to, the expansion, right, of a business to help provide further assistance. So, I think that once again, going through the, does it meet a national objective? Does it, who what are you creating? And the job, does it create jobs in there? And being able to check off some of those, I think this would be a really good business to look further into what they're providing, who their clientele is, where it's going to be located, and does it have a clear pathways to have a tie back to coronavirus? Do you have anything else on that one, Dion?
Nope. I think it all comes down to, when you're looking at national objective, you also have to consider documentation requirements. So if you're going to go with something like LMC, then you have to determine how are you going to garner the documentation around meeting that national objective, right? Because it's always about the paperwork.
Yeah, definitely. And in everything, in all the analyses that occur under economic development, there is a criteria. I just call it underwriting criteria. And this is really when you're going through and making sure that the project helps, or the activity, meets the PPR, right? The prevention, preparing, responding to coronavirus. Is it eligible costs? Is it feasible? Identifying the owner's equity is not that it's not unreasonably high, that they're just utilizing the program to try to get rich. And then, the way that the funds are going to be dispersed out. So this is, this is this type of analysis that everyone has to do on an individual basis for each project to ensure that it remains eligible. I think there was also, Dion, another question that came in through the chat.
There's a bunch of them.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry.
So here's another one. Are home-based businesses eligible?
Home-based businesses. Yes. Yes, they would be eligible. There's it could be, or let me utilize that term. It could be, as long as we go through and we do the analysis on each, what is it doing? Does it meet the national objective? Who is the customers? What is the base, in reference to that.
Right. And again, in the communities that we've been working with, this has been a real question for them. Do they limit it to just storefronts where people can kind of see the business, or especially considering that many home-based businesses are micro enterprises, do they really want to double down on supporting those. And then the other thing that I would just note is when you do provide support and programs for home-based businesses, obviously you have to consider what the funds are being utilized for, right? Because it is a home and a business. So, you know, they may not have rent that they're paying.
You're up. We lost.
I just dropped for a second there. Sorry about that. But that's just something to keep in mind, is that you have to be careful about what kinds of things you would pay for in that circumstance, and being really clear that they are specifically for the purpose of the business.
Yep.
And then let's do two more, and then we can move on. And obviously we can continue to come back to these.
Okay.
What if the small business, which is under 5 employees, that are not low mod income themselves, but they want to help low mod income employees with repairs? Example, East Coast basement flooding. Can CDBG assist in covering low income coverage for that category?
Low basement?
Right. So
I'm not sure I know what that is, Dia.
So it seems like the example is saying, let's say that we're a small business and we're on the East Coast, and you know, our employees aren't necessarily all low moderate income, but maybe at their home they have a flooding issue. Can we utilize our business funds to help an employee with the issues in their home and pay for those repairs?
Yeah, no, I don't see how that is. You know, that is not the business is, that's not the economic development business line. That's something more that would seem to come under, you know, goodwill toward all. You know, something that maybe the employer does on their own, but not with CDBG dollars. So that does not check any of the boxes of for eligible activities.
Right, and it's definitely not an economic development activity. The grantee might have a program that provides assistance to low mod homeowners that perhaps those employees could apply for directly, but it wouldn't be something that they would get through their employee in terms of CDBG funds. Okay, so let's do one more. Can you repeat the statement that an activity does not have to be in a low mod area? Can you provide more clarification?
Okay, so an economic development organization does not necessarily have to be in a low mod area. It could be that job is providing, they may get some assistance, and they actually have low mod employees. They have jobs, okay? And that's what they're providing, and they can be assisted in that manner. So it all depends, it doesn't have to be located in an LMA. It could be the job, and they're still considered to be a small organization or a small business, and they actually provide job opportunities to LMI staff and employees. Okay. And speaking of, we're going to go on to job training. It's just one more slide I wanted to outline and show, because under economic development, one of the things is making sure that individuals are skilled in being able to have meaningful work. So some organizations are created so that they could provide job training. And this helps unemployed or underemployed individuals to gain those skills so that they can be viable individuals in the community and be able to provide for their needs. Part of that job training also helps sometimes with a placement, right? So not only helping them learn a particular type of trade. Not, would say the old adage, it's not giving a fish, but it's teaching you how to fish. So some of you, I'm sure, can you remember that saying. So it actually helps them get that training, and it could be anything from custodial. There's been, even some construction. It could be, teaching folks how culinary as well. But they also not just trains the persons, but also has a job linkage, so that there are some employers when they're looking for new employees, they may work and have a partnership where that applicant or that individual, the underemployed individual who has been trained can now grab and have a job within somewhere, within the community. So that is definitely a definite eligible activity under CDBG-CV. And just so that you all know, we see that this is considered to be a public service. It is also part of the allowable special economic development project, and it also could be under micro enterprise. So there's 3 different areas within CDBG that and the national objectives that it can come under, but it is definitely a really good use of CDBG-CV to the community. So let's talk a little bit more about technical assistance. Dion, do you think you can walk us through that? You are muted.
I was muted. Sorry about that. I'm happy to do that. If you would just take one more question before we move on to technical assistance, that would be great. So the question is, could a nonprofit agency receive CDBG funds to build a resale shop and employ low and moderate income residents to run the shop? Would that be eligible?
So nonprofit, a small business wants to open a retail shop, okay, and it employ. So it is providing jobs. So remember, we're talking about CDBG-CV. So the next question I would ask is, how does it prepare for, prevent, or respond? What is the tieback? So there has to be a tieback, and just want to make sure that we're all in the same posture. We are talking about CDBG-CV, right? And so we're talking, all of this has to do about, everything related to coronavirus. And so part of that tieback, you've got to ask those questions. How would a retail, or creating a retail store or how does that prevent, prepare, or respond to coronavirus? And we will probably see that there is not a direct linkage. So, that one would need to be fleshed out more. So it's not just about the jobs. If it was just about creating jobs, then that would be, that could be potentially under the regular entitlement CDBG. But we're still talking about CV.
That is a great point, because I know we have a lot of folks. So yesterday morning, we did a little survey of who was joining these sessions, and a lot of folks are not only new to CDBG-CV, as we all are, but many people are also new to the regular block grant program. And so these trainings are kind of an opportunity to learn both, but it's super important to make sure that we clarify what might work under the regular block grant program versus the extra considerations and sometimes the flexibilities that come with the CV component, the CARES Act funding specifically. All right.
Fantastic.
So let's keep going and dig in. And I'm seeing a lot of questions come in that are really great, and a lot of questions that are clarifications of previous questions, because people have very specific, non-hypothetical, clearly, situations. So we'll try to get to those as we can, but we do want to make sure that we cover kind of the basic requirements and considerations, and then we can really dig into these very specific examples as we get further down the line and time allows. So want to come back to something that Deidre mentioned at the beginning, which is technical assistance. And it is in the regular CDBG program, its own eligible activity. So you can provide technical assistance to nonprofits, and we usually call it capacity building in that instance. But specifically as an economic development activity, you can provide technical assistance to businesses. And a lot of times we think of this as like business incubators or those micro enterprise programs that, help people understand how to file their LLC documentation or how to set up their accounting or bookkeeping or inventory systems, right? And so there's a lot that you can do here. And the primary purpose in the general theory is growth and helping startups, and especially bringing businesses into your community that the community needs. But obviously, in the times that we live in, a lot of that assistance is currently focused on reducing the risk of failure. So helping businesses to stay up and running, helping them to think through how to streamline or how to utilize certain technologies right now, right? I can't tell you, if I didn't have a phone, I would never be able to read another menu at a restaurant again, because now they all have QR codes. But if I am a small mom and pop restaurant, how do I figure out how to get my menu online and create a QR code and do that at a cost that isn't prohibitive to me, because maybe I have daily specials and I need to update it all the time, right? So we really want to be thinking about technical assistance as being a partner to them in not only reducing their risk of failure, but in helping them to ultimately succeed. And so that might be things like developing business plans, or, deciding if they're going to use QuickBooks or Peachtree, or how to get that 1099 bookkeeper because they can't afford to have one on salary. It can be offered by itself just as a service, or in conjunction with a loan or a grant. A lot of places will require, especially for startups, that in order for them to get funding, they participate in some sort of technical assistance process, whether it's an incubator or meeting with sort of their business coach on a monthly basis, right? So it can look a lot of different ways, but the idea is that we want to make sure that they're really being set up for success. And right now, also being helped to figure out how to deal with so many of the barriers that they're facing. One really important thing to note is that a DUNS number is not required in order for a business just to receive technical assistance. Now, if they're also receiving direct funding, we know that all organizations that receive federal funding need to have their DUNS number, but if they're just getting technical assistance, they do not. So when you're talking about literally startups who are just doing their business plan and don't have their first client or widget or customer yet, they don't need a DUNS number, right? Because you're really just providing them with the technical assistance. When we look at doing this under the block grant program, there are a couple of different ways that we can make this happen. Okay? And you hear this a lot. You just heard this for job training. You can do it as public services. You can do it as low-mod jobs, right? So the good news is there's flexibility, but it also means that you have to sort of think through what makes the most sense for your goals, the folks you're trying to serve, and the documentation requirements that come along with it, right? So you can absolutely do it as a special economic development activity. I call them SPEDs because that, special economic development just sounds like somebody won the lottery, and that's usually not what's happening. The thing there, and we're going to talk about this more in just a minute, is that when you do special economic development activities, they have to meet that public benefit test. And so if you're not trying to deal with that in the documentation, perhaps it's micro enterprise assistance, especially if you are just helping startups. Micro enterprise might be the appropriate way to go with that. You can also utilize a CBDO, community-based development organization, right? And if you were with me first thing yesterday morning, we talked a little bit about CBDOs and what they are and what they can do. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that. But again, you still have that public benefit test caveat. So just keep in mind that the only theory under which you're not going to trigger that is really if we're talking about those micro enterprise types of businesses, right? So those small, less than 5, including the owners, kinds of activities. Now, if you are working with the CBDO, just a reminder from yesterday morning, CBDOs can do 3 kinds of things. They can do community economic development, right, which is the thing that we're focused on in this conversation. They can also do neighborhood revitalization and energy conservation. And there are all kinds of rules in terms of how you qualify them that are very similar, as Deidre mentioned earlier, to the CHOTO requirements. But the one thing to really keep in mind is that it's not that they can do these 3 kinds of things. It's that in order to qualify as a CBDO, these are the only 3 types of activities that that organization can carry out, not just with CDBG funds, but generally speaking. Okay. Now, as we talked about yesterday morning, if you're working with an organization that is a CBDO, you do get some flexibilities, right? The primary one is on the job training front. If they're doing it, it doesn't count against the public services cap. And that's a really important point. There was a question in the Q&A earlier about why would you even use public services for job training because of the cap, given the fact that you can also use special economic development. Well, it doesn't always count against the cap, right? And we know that with current flexibilities, at least on the temporary public services side, the 15% cap wasn't as much of an issue. But generally speaking, this is really the biggest flexibility that you get on the economic development side when you're working with the CBDO is the fact that the job training doesn't count against public services, so you don't have to be concerned about that. As you know, probably, hopefully, there are other things that a CBDO also gets you flexibility on, right? New housing construction, again, that's in the housing section. That doesn't get talked about as economic development. Job training, which we just talked about, NRSAs, neighborhood revitalization strategy areas, again, not under the economic development component, but important to realize that all of these things are really why we go through the process of sometimes figuring out whether or not an organization that we want to have as a partner can qualify as a CBDO, because there are times when it can be super helpful, right? And get you that additional flexibility that really makes it more feasible, especially from a capacity perspective, to carry out some of these kinds of activities. So technical assistance is totally appropriate. It can be all by itself or as part of a financial process, whether you design that as a grant or a loan. But the idea around technical assistance for businesses is really to increase the I hate to say reducing the likelihood of failure, increasing the likelihood of success, right? Half full rather than half empty. Although I know these days we're pretty much living the half empty kind of life, right? So back to half empty. I'm sorry, go ahead.
I'm sorry, Deanne. I just wanted to interrupt just for a second. We've got quite a few questions that's there.
Sure.
And wanted to see if you wanted to respond back to a few of them.
Let's do it.
All right. So when we're talking about eligible uses under CDBG, can it pay for interns under the job training category? And And then the second part of that is, can it also pay for consultants that provide seminar regarding how to start a business?
Those are really great examples, and they fall under two different activity categories, right? So you can absolutely pay a consultant to do a seminar. That would be under the technical assistance category, probably, right? And oftentimes those are, done as a business incubator, where every month you have a special guest speaker or you're doing weekly trainings. So that's totally okay. The other part of the question, it just disappeared on me. So hold on, let me see if I can grab it real quick. Interns, yes. So the thing with job training is it has to actually, unless you're going to do it under public services, if you're going to use low mod jobs, it has to result in a job at the end of the training. So if you have an internship program, or some sort of job training program where there's a direct linkage to a business that is going to hire the folks who complete that job training, then that could be totally appropriate.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Thank you. And I think that you just, by way of that question, also gave some examples of what's eligible. What are the eligible expenses for job training program?
Absolutely. And in addition to, paying stipends, very often participants need help with equipment if it's a specialized program, whether it's an apprenticeship program or a nursing program or something like that. So you can pay for equipment. You can pay the organization that's providing the job training for, the labor costs of the trainers. So think of it as kind of like you would fund a nonprofit under public services. What are all of the costs of delivering that program?
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Awesome.
That's even though you're not doing it hopefully as a public service, you think of it similarly. So not only the cost of delivering, but the cost of participating in the program. So stipends, equipment, books, all those kinds of things might be eligible depending upon how you design your program.
Awesome. We have one on the DUNS number. We were talking about that when you were speaking about technical assistance. So is a DUNS number required just for economic development and business activities, or is it required for anyone receiving entitlement CDBG?
Yeah, DUNS numbers are a thing, aren't they?
They are a thing.
So they are required to receive funding. It doesn't necessarily prohibit when you're providing technical assistance to startups, because again, they're not receiving money. So if somebody is receiving a service like a beneficiary, right? So direct beneficiaries never have to have a DUNS number. But if you are entering into a contractual contractor, developer, subrecipient relationship, you want to be looking at those requirements, and you want for them to have a DUNS number, just as you have to check to make sure that there's no issues around suspension and debarment and all of that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Thank you. And we have three more, I think and then we can move on. Wouldn't it be difficult to assist startups with CDBG-CV because you can't establish PPR tieback?
So that is a fabulous question.
It is.
And it's actually answered and addressed in the quick guide. So there is an economic development quick guide that I'm pretty sure Capital Access actually wrote and was approved by HUD and is posted as part of the toolkit that was linked to in your chat. And the idea is that startup business might be replacing a business that was lost to the community due to COVID, or it might be employing people who lost their jobs due to COVID. So not necessarily, right? There are some really good examples in the quick guide around this that I would encourage you to take a look at. But while it seems like on its face that doesn't make any sense, if you think about the outcomes that they might achieve, there's absolutely the potential for that to be eligible and for you to establish the PPR tieback.
Awesome. How long can a federally procured consultant be before going out for procurement again?
So that's a great question. And there is a financial management session tomorrow that covers procurement. I will just say that there is nothing statutory or regulatory about this. But good practice is usually every 3 to 5 years, but that's a good practice. There's nothing in writing. And most important is that you follow your own policy around whatever that requirement is. So if Dion's over here saying, oh, every 5 years is fine, and your policy says every 2 years, then it's every 2 years.
Yeah. Can you pay for computers for low-income students for the training?
Absolutely. That is a supply. It's important to understand the financial threshold in order to call something equipment. And most computers on a per unit basis don't come anywhere near qualifying as equipment. So they qualify as supplies. And just like a lot of schools were utilizing and purchasing tablets for their students to be able to participate online from home, buying laptops for folks, or if they're going through a specialized program that requires them to have like a handheld tablet to put the software on, totally appropriate.
Yep.
You want to have a policy around how those are accounted for, but it's not the same kind of policy in terms of inventory and asset reversion that you would have if it was actually equipment.
Thank you. And thank you, Dion. That was a slip of my tongue between, I said equipment, you said supply. So, and spot on the supply. That's exactly what it was. My apologies.
No problem.
And the last has to do with retaining the job. If you're retaining jobs or creating jobs as an objective, how long would you have to monitor the job to demonstrate that it's still in existence?
Oh, the big gray, right? Don't we love those gray areas where there's no hard and fast rule? So there are a couple of considerations here, and I welcome Deidre you to chime in as well.
Yeah.
So one of the things that you want to think about is what's the investment that you're making. So when we've been working with grantees, you know, how long they're going to track if they're providing $2,500 per job versus $25,000 per job is two different things. And then you also really want to think about the industry that you're supporting, right? So jobs in different industries have different tenures or needs. The most important thing, again, is to have a policy. We're seeing everything from in this current environment. So we're talking about CV, 6 months to 2 years, just kind of depending. Now, obviously, if they're creating jobs, you can't even start counting it until it exists, right? So that's, you have to, if you're counting on new jobs, then you have to hang out and wait until that job actually comes to fruition. But when we're talking about retaining jobs, you're really looking at, you know, with the CV funds, I think what we're mostly seeing is about a year. And Deidre, I don't know if you all are seeing something similar.
Yes, very similar, but also they're looking at the period of performance and making sure, because if you have the job that's there, and hey, look, the job, what if the employee doesn't last because they were a royal screw up? You know, in reference to that doesn't necessarily negate that the funds have to come back to the program. But if that is a position and they have that position that's there, then, you know, and that retains for the length of the period of performance and or the year, then, you know, it's still compliant. So I think that we can, at this point, I think the very last question before we move on has to do, we got some more in there. So nonprofits are eligible for grants, loans under special economic activity. That's on there, yes. So nonprofits are eligible for grants and loans as well. Special economic activity. Also, allows for the for-profit as well. So it expands it out and gives you that allowance. So definitely nonprofits, but also the for-profits.
Yeah, and I would just add to that.
Mm-hmm.
To be totally candid, why would you want to? And by that, I mean, if they're a nonprofit, there are probably a lot of other ways that you can provide them funding other than through economic development. So I would really look at what it is they're asking for funding for and figure out if there's a way for you to support that activity in another way. All right, so the answer is yes, but that might not be the activity category that makes the most sense for them, depending upon what they're doing, because you can fund nonprofits sort of in so many other categories within CDBG. All right, so, oh yeah, let's talk about underwriting. That's everybody's favorite thing. That'll make me hugely popular. All right, underwriting. Now you see the word voluntary, and then you see, of course, immediately following it, a little asterisk. So back to our earlier point about nonprofit versus for-profit. If you're assisting for-profit businesses, you can just remove the term voluntary from this slide. If you are providing economic development activity assistance to a nonprofit, it is voluntary, but it's just good business practice, all right? And the idea behind this is that HUD wants to make sure that as you're committing CDBG funds to an economic development activity, there's been some penciling done, right? The same way that if you were funding the construction of new homes or paying for a multifamily development, you would absolutely want to see the underwriting to make sure that the project's going to succeed. The same thing here. You want to make sure that the costs are reasonable, right? Because 2 CFR Part 200 applies in terms of cost reasonableness. That they have the money, not just your money, but all the money is committed, right? There's nothing worse than being the first one in, and then your activity sits open in IDIS and sits open in IDIS and is still open in IDIS because they don't have all of the money to actually finish it out so that you can meet your national objective, right? So you want to make sure that the money is really there to make this happen. You also want to make sure that they're not just supplanting other non-federal funds with CDBG. So they're not just going, oh, there's CDBG money and we could get this loan, but we're not going to do that. Okay. So that you're not being sort of subbed in, that it's feasible, that the return on investment is reasonable. And again, reasonable is not a hard and fast number. It has to be determined based upon, the risk profile and how much of an investment does the owner actually have in, or the folks who are going to see that return. Okay, so it's not necessarily a specific number, but as an example, if this is a project that is potentially 100% CDBG funded and there's going to be no debt on it at all, and the owner is going to get a 30% return, maybe doesn't qualify as reasonable, right? So maybe there needs to be a loan in there somewhere and it's not all grant money. And then finally, that the CDBG funds are distributed pro rata. So for those of you who live and breathe the home program, you know all about pro rata, right? The idea that CDBG is not putting in a larger proportion of the funds than the benefits that they are seeing, whether those benefits are being measured in terms of job creation or retention, or serving low and moderate income people, right? Goods and services, no matter how they're being measured, the idea is that the amount of money going into the project has to make sense for the public benefit that is coming out of the project, right? And one of the ways that we do that and make that part of the determination is through the public benefit test. And we've already mentioned this a bunch in terms of what you have to do it for, what you don't have to do it for, but we haven't really talked about what it is. Okay? So again, as a quick recap, you have to do the public benefit test for special economic development, okay, for those CBDO projects, right? As well as for public improvement projects. So think roads, sidewalks, infrastructure, if they're being classified as low mod jobs, okay? And it's more than $10,000 per job in CDBG assistance. So again, not if you're classifying it under public facilities and it's a low mod area national objective, but when we're talking about low mod jobs, that's what you're really looking at there. So in those instances, you must carry out the public benefit test and it has to meet the test. Okay? What it doesn't apply to are a couple of things. One is micro enterprise, yay, right? Although honestly, the reason is because it's kind of a non-issue in terms of level of assistance. And it doesn't apply to commercial rehab because a lot of times we're not necessarily measuring commercial rehab by low mod jobs. So for the most part, what we're really talking about is we're actually either creating or retaining jobs or goods and services to low and moderate income folks, right? And those are the two ways that you get to be able to determine the benefit. So you'll see that there's two different economic factors here, just like meeting the low mod jobs national objective, where you can either do it through creating and retaining jobs or by goods or services. Okay. And here's the rub. We talk about this as a test, but it's actually two tests. Okay? There's an individual test that every project has to meet. Okay? And then there's an aggregate test at the program level. So again, this might feel fairly familiar, right? So in the low mod arena, if you're doing a low mod area, we know the rule is 51%, but we know at the grant level, 70% of the funds have to be used for low mod activities. So a lot of times in a lot of programs, you see this dual testing system, right? And it's feels a little weird, but the purpose of it, honestly, is to create some flexibility for you, right? And so as I walk through and explain the requirements for program versus individual, I'll try and get to some clarity. It can be tough and it's early in the morning. It's 7:22 here on the West Coast, but I'm going to do my best to provide some clarity around what the requirements are. One thing to note, though, is that you apply the test when you're obligating the funds, but then you do have to come back and actually assess it once you've completed. So obviously, could go up or down depending upon the amount of funds spent and the number of jobs or goods and services that are related, right? But you have to apply it at the time of obligation. And you also have to pick which category, which option you're going to use for measuring, right? So you can't be like, oh, we're going to use this, but this turned out to be better, right? So you have to be clear about what you're really trying to get to. All right, so let's talk about aggregate standards. This is the program level standard, okay? And this creates the floor for the program. I want you to think about this. Think about it this way. This is the absolute minimum of, generally speaking, what has to happen globally for your program. So here are your options. You can either create or retain at least one FTE permanent job, right? Because we always know when we're measuring jobs, they have to be permanent jobs for every $35,000 of CDBG funds, or provide goods and services or services to at least one low mod income person per every $350 of CDBG funds. So let's do some easy math. Let's take an example so that we can really walk through this, right? And again, keep in mind, we're talking about the aggregate standard. So this is the program right? So it applies to all of the activities obligated in any given program year. Okay. And then one note, obviously, if you're doing just a job training activity, it's the job standard, because job training is not about providing goods and services. So if we take our math and we say, okay, we have a $350,000 program, okay, and we know that the requirement is $35,000 per job or $350 per program served. That means that at the program level, I have to create at least 10 jobs, okay, or create or retain, or provide goods and services to a minimum of 1,000 low and moderate income persons. Okay, so those are my two choices that I'm looking at. So just keep that in mind. At the aggregate level, I have this $350,000 program. I've got, that's how much money we have obligated to it. Means we got to roll out of here with 10 jobs or serving at least 1,000 LMI persons. So hold that in your head. 10. 10 is the number to me. Now, let's talk about the individual standard. The individual standard says that for any given project, not program, project, I can't spend more than $50,000 per FTE or $1,000 per low mod income person goods and services, right? So that seems weird, because if I take that, let's take that same $350,000, and maybe I have a $350,000 program, and I end up using all of that money to fund one $350,000 project. If I do the math here, right, and this is where if we were live in person, I'd have a flip chart and I'd be with a marker, right, doing the math, and people would have their phones out trying to get to their calculators. It'd be awesome crazy, because who doesn't like math at 7:27 in the morning, West Coast time, okay? If I do the math this way, this says that for that same $350,000, I only have to have 7 jobs or serve 350 low and moderate income persons. Well, I got news for you. How does that make sense? Right? Because if I think about it, it doesn't make any sense to me at all. At the project level, I only have to have 7 jobs, but you're saying at the program level, I have to have 10. But how can I have 10 if I only have 7? Well, the answer, my friends, is you have to have 10. So I said at the beginning, the program is the floor. That's the minimum. What you see at the individual level is flexibility. And flexibility means that I may have a particular project that is so important, that is so critical, that it's worth it for me to go up to that $50,000 cap. However, I'm going to have to balance that with another project where they're going to get significantly less than $35,000 per job, so that when I add the two of them together and divide, I'm meeting my program threshold, okay? So the program is what you have to meet. Within that, at the project level, you get some flexibility up to a maximum of $50,000 per job, right? But for every project that you give $50,000 per job to, you're gonna have to find somebody who can give you a whole lot of jobs for a whole little money, because you got to be able to balance it out, right? So the individual standard and the aggregate standard can be super confusing and frustrating. And in all honesty, it's one of the reasons why sometimes in the regular CDBG program, people shy away from economic development, is tests like this where the math makes your brain hurt. And you're like, if I can find a way to not have to worry about that, I'm just gonna not worry about that, okay? So those are the requirements under the regular program. I have fabulous news for you. There's a waiver and an alternative requirement under CDBG-CV. So enjoy this moment while it lasts. Okay. So the Federal Register notice, which you have heard at this point, I am sure ad nauseum about, right? Because we're all talking about the waivers and the alternative requirements that are in there, but this one's super important. So it waived, and you can see on the screen, 24,570,209B1 and 2, also known as the location of the requirement for the aggregate test, right? So shorthand, it waived the aggregate public benefit standard, which means, okay, if I don't have to worry about that, do I still have to worry about the individual one? So the aggregate is the $35,000 per job one. So that just got waived. The individual one is the $50,000 per job requirement under usual times. But again, we have waivers, and then we also have these beautiful things called alternative requirements. And while they've waived the aggregate test, they've also created an alternative requirement, love these terms, for the individual project test. And what that means is that we don't have to worry about 50,000. We've got even more flexibility. So there's no aggregate, there's no program level. Mm-hmm. And at the project level, we're not talking about $50,000. We're now talking about $85,000. Okay, so one job minimum, you always want more, right? You always want to ask for more. This is a negotiation. You ask for more, but you have to get to at least one FTE permanent job for every $85,000 of CDBG funds, or if we're doing the beautiful goods and services, $1,700, of CDBG funds. I know that feels like a really random number, but it is what it is. And you can do the math on those, right? So if I break out my calculator and I say, okay, so for my $350,000, wait, how many jobs do I have to create now? Like 4, right? Instead of 7 or 10. Okay. So it can substantially change in the short term for the CV funds, your ability to really meet that need, right? Do keep in mind, however, that this flexibility is intended to really provide assistance because, again, PPR, right? There's got to be some sort of tie back to coronavirus. And again, we've talked about the fact that it could be a startup replacing a business that has closed down or hiring folks who lost their jobs because of coronavirus. So when you look at the wonderful economic development quick guide that is part of the CDBG-CV toolkit, there are some really good examples in there. But this is a way for you to be able to assist businesses at a higher sort of per job level than you would normally be able to within those same categories, because HUD basically has recognized that there is a public benefit to doing this work, right? Economic recovery is absolutely critical to the overall health and well-being of all of our communities. And so for that reason, we're able to do this. So I hate the fact that the poll question that we're going to do right now is actually really a test of Dion. It's, did Dion do a good enough job trying to clarify the unclarifiable? So we're going to pop up the poll for you. And just a quick quiz, to make sure you're still with us before we jump into the remaining Q&A, right? So as soon as we can, I don't see the quiz coming, the poll option coming up quite yet. So there it is. So true or false, right? So please go ahead and vote. Economic development activities assisted with CDBG-CV funds are not subject to the individual public benefit standard. Be my friends, Say I did a good job explaining this. Answer it correctly, please. I don't want to get an F. All right, so looks like we've got some responses. And I'm actually going to go with kind of false, right? So it is false on its face because economic development activities are still subject to the individual public benefit standard. However, it's a different standard. So technically they're both right, which means I'm fabulous and I get an A+ for teaching. But generally speaking, it should be false because while there is a waiver for the aggregate standard, there's not a waiver for individual public benefit standard, but there is an increase in the cap amount. So I'm not mad at you 19 folks. I love you anyway. We're going to go with you misread the question. You misunderstood the assignment. That's okay. I can appreciate that. So with that, I think, Deidre, we are wrapped up on the fabulousness of the slides. I see all kinds of questions.
All kinds of questions in there. Then should we start for the bottom or the top? Let's just go ahead and start from the bottom. Since I'm there, can any business qualify as providing goods and services to LMI persons?
Maybe. So are they providing goods and services to low and moderate income persons? The challenge with this is not that they might be. The challenge with this is how are you going to document that they are, right? So I see that my esteemed colleague, Jeremy Newberg, has joined us this morning. And I'm so excited to see his little picture down there on my screen. So Jeremy, I am going to honor you by quoting your favorite quote, Mr. Stephen Covey, which is begin with the end in mind.
That's it.
Right? So always start with these questions from a how am I going to prove it perspective, right? At the end of the day, what's the documentation that you're going to need in order to be able to meet that criteria? So yes, maybe, but you want to be really clear about how you're going to prove that that's a fact.
And sure, definitely spot on, Dion, with that. We also have, you went over the waivers. There was a question, is there a waiver? There are several waivers. There's a few, yes, that we went over. But can you use the waiver with CDBG funds that can be tied to PPR because we don't have enough CV funding?
So the waivers in the Federal Register notice are specific to the CARES Act appropriation. So those waivers only apply to that funding. You can always request an individual waiver from HUD for a specific reason and have that considered and responded to by them, but you wouldn't be able to use that existing waiver that only applies to the CV funds, although you might utilize that as part of your case for your individual waiver request.
Yeah. Now, are there examples of when it would make more sense to use goods and services instead of jobs?
There are, and from my perspective, they're few and far between, but that's me. And I could totally be wrong. Let's give an example. If you are providing, let's say, $40,000 or $100,000 or $200,000 to a storefront that's going to come into a low or moderate income area community, and maybe it is a amenity that community has been sorely lacking for a super long time. And we all know what that looks like, right? Because there's a whole list of things we wish we had in our most disinvested communities, whether they be banks or pharmacies or dry cleaners or grocery stores, right? There's all kinds of things that we want. There are times when the dollar value per FTE isn't going to get you there. But if you look at their service area and the number of low and moderate income persons who are going to be able to be served by that business, it can totally make sense. So let's go back to our earlier example of the $350,000. Maybe I want to provide $350,000 to a small storefront pharmacy, because we don't have a pharmacy within a 15 block radius, right? And they only have 5 employees, right? Well, that's not going to get me there, right? They might have a whole bunch of part-times, but when you add them up, it adds up to 5 FTEs or 6 FTEs or 7. It doesn't get me to my minimum per job number. But I look at the service area and I realize there's 3,000 people in that, 6 block radius who now are going to have a pharmacy, and we can document that. Right? And so that might be an example. You're really going to look at it mostly where the per job number doesn't make sense, or maybe they're not low mod jobs, right? Maybe they're pharmacy techs and those aren't low mod jobs. So you're really looking at it from my perspective, and it's an important community amenity, and you can't otherwise get to the per job number. So I hope that's helpful.
Yes, thank you, Dion. So this actually seems like it's pretty related. How do you prove that a business is providing goods and services to LMI persons?
So there are a couple of different ways to do this. And I would absolutely, as you're designing your program, talk with your HUD rep about sort of the data that is available, right? Because you're going to start off before you even decide to do it by doing an area survey, figuring out what the service area would be, figuring out how many low mod households are within that service area. And then you're going to talk to the business, right? It might be that the kind of business that it is, say, for example, it's a clinic. And they can very clearly tell based on insurance whether or not somebody's low mod income, right? Versus a pharmacy that may not be able to tell as easily. So you're going to want to consult with your HUD CPD rep, but also talk with the business about their ideas for how they might be able to demonstrate that.
Awesome. Thank you so much on that, Dion. So so when we're talking about, it was interesting about the underwriting guidelines. We've got participants who understand what the guidelines are and what the purpose is, but how to underwrite. So they were looking for any additional guidance, training, or resources that can actually, since we couldn't see your blackboard if we had paper, remember? we would do all of that and do all the calculations. So is there a guidance of how to do that?
So that's actually a great capital access question, because you all have created some fabulous resources related to underwriting and economic development and small business programs, some of which are actually, I know, being used right now for the economic development cohort that HUD is conducting with a sort of small group of local grantees. So Deidre, is that something that you want to speak to?
Actually, I wanted to see, is Jeremy, can you come off of mute? Okay, maybe he can't. So yeah, we definitely have some examples in reference to that. We have been participating.
Hi.
Oh,
hello.
Hey everyone. This is
Hello,
Jeremy
everyone.
Newberg.
Hi. Happy Thursday morning. And I just want to applaud Dion and Deidre for providing clarity to challenging regulatory structures within the context of COVID. Bravo to both of you. What's the question?
examples of how to do the calculation, the underwriting calculation for the aggregate, for the individual standards, public benefit standards.
You mean for the jobs or for the goods and services?
I think the question, Jeremy, was actually around underwriting tools.
Underwriting tools, yeah. Yes.
Okay. So underwriting is always a function of the type of assistance. Typically in economic development, specifically special economic development for a for-profit business entity, you have working capital. Working capital is very fluid. And the key to working capital is to back into what is the unmet working capital need. And so first of all, you have to tap into, that's too casual of a verb. You have to clarify the period for which you need working capital assistance. Is it 3 months? Is it 6 months? Is it a year? What's the time frame? With COVID small business economic assistance, when we first started, say in the spring and summer of 2020, typically we were seeing $5,000 to $10,000 grants to just get you through the next 3 months. And so that was the period of performance. So then you can look backwards and you can look forward in the underwriting. And this is where people's eyes glaze over. So I'm going to try to break this down as clearly as I can. The looking backward is actually looking at the balance sheet, where you see what are the change in the assets, the current assets, which is basically cash and receivables, minus the change in current liabilities. What's a current liability? Your payables, your short-term payables, and your credit card debt. If you're short-term financing, nothing long-term, nothing capital. And so you choose a point in time, say, a year before the COVID crisis started, compared to the time of application, and you want to see. Typically what happens is, all my cash went down because my revenue was shut down. I ate through my cash. And, I wanted to keep people employed. I needed to get inventory. So I ran up my credit card or my credit line. Well, that eats up working capital. That's one calculation, looking backward on the balance sheet. The other way of calculating the unmet need is income and expenses. And what we do is we have the applicant do a projection of the next 3 or 6 months and show how you're going to use the CDBG funds to infuse capital into the business to maybe retain jobs, pay your lease, pay your utilities, your overhead, invest more in marketing, buy some more inventory to recover and grow. Now, you may still show an operating deficit, but it's a projection into the future, positioning the business to recover. And so in that income and expense look forward analysis, you want the business to do a projection of, if I get this money, what am I going to do with it? And how does it make progress towards achieving the national objective and positioning the business for growth? So working capital's assistance is all about how much do you need in working capital? What are you going to do with it? How will it position the business to recover from the coronavirus pandemic, either from a public health or economic impact perspective? So that's working capital. The next is if you've got construction or renovation, COVID resiliency improvement, some type of improvement to your business facility that will satisfy the prevent, prepare, and respond to the coronavirus. We created a term we call COVID resiliency improvements, and it's the idea of what hazards exist in the building where you could do things like replacing HVAC, increasing air exchange, removing respiratory hazards, and also maybe redesigning your floor plan for better spacing and partitioning. Those are COVID resiliency improvements. There, the underwriting is what is cost reasonable, and are you preventing undue enrichment? Now, construction costs have gone up. We have massive supply chain issues. They're starting to subside, but there was disruption. And so you're looking at what is a reasonable improvement. If this is a business that just leases 3,000 square feet and they want to do $300,000 in improvements, really? A new HVAC system should only cost about $20,000 for that much space, and then maybe you have some ancillary improvements related to that. You have old knob and tube wiring. It's got to be proportional, okay? And then if you're doing a grant, then you stop there. If you're doing a servicing loan, then you have to look at the business's ability to service the loan with excess cash flow. That was a really long answer. I hope it helped.
Jeremy, you're the king of clarity. Also, it was like the verbal version of a spreadsheet. So really cool. Well done, sir. Well done.
Thank you.
All right. I know we are coming up on the top of the hour, but the good news is we only have a few questions left that are sitting open. So we want to try and get to those, leave no proverbial stone unturned. So let's see what else we have left here. I'm looking for an easy one. I want an here's an easy one. So please explain typically reimbursed expenses in a job training program. Is it instructor time, books, technical supplies? All of those are very common expenses that are incurred. It might also be space for the training. It might be stipends for the participants. It could be technical supplies, not only for the course, but that they need to participate, whether it's uniforms or hard hats or certain tools. So again, think of it literally as a program, right? So if you had a nonprofit running any other kind of program, what are all the kinds of things that you might provide? And I would say the one primary difference between those kinds of programs and this is that there are times when you will actually provide potentially a stipend for the trainees so that they're able to fully participate and still, cover a little bit of bills. But other than that, it's really like every other program in terms of it needs a place to exist. It needs somebody to teach it. It needs the supplies and the flip chart paper and all that kind of, markers. Markers are a big one for me. I go through a lot of markers.
Yeah. Thank you, Dion. Let's go ahead, and this was addressed a little bit earlier, but it bears to repeat. Clarification on an earlier question: what if the small business wants to help LMI residents with repairs? Can CDBG assist in covering low-income residents for that category?
Good question.
It's a very good question, and I would then go back to the question of, remember, this is economic development. So is this a good use of those dollars in economic development? Because really CDBG can do the repairs, and of course CDBG-CV can do alterations on individuals' homes as well to make sure that it had, for safety purposes, like the air exchange. So if a business that's what they're doing, so they're like they're a little nonprofit, and that's what they are creating. Their business line is actually doing rehab on individuals' homes. We'd have to really question if economic development is the best use that's there versus, yeah. So
I think it's a great example of a owner-occupied rehab program that the grantee themselves might run. And then the question is, how do you help the small business apply to be a contractor in that program and actually be able to deliver that service, right? So perhaps you have, and I certainly know when I worked at the city level and we had an owner-occupied rehab program, it was a struggle getting contractors who, wanted to plan our sandbox in a timely manner at a cost reasonable number, right? So all these caveats. And perhaps that's something that you think about is there a technical assistance to businesses component specifically built around helping these small businesses participate in your programs, right? As contractors, not necessarily as recipients.
And let's go to as far as examples of systems, programs, or Excel templates used to track aggregate benefits across a program. So there are some resources. I believe that we've tried to direct everyone. I'm going to say it again. There is an economic development toolkit, a CDBG-CV toolkit that has many resources that are there, templates, and then other manuals, and so it would quick guides. I would highly recommend that you visit that website and utilize what's there. And it's always it's live, so we're always adding new things, new information up there, updating as well. Dion?
And there's a lot of information on the HUD Exchange related to economic development more generally. I will say that you need to think about what works for you. And honestly, unless you have an enormous economic development program, an Excel spreadsheet works just fine, right? So we've built monster spreadsheets for stuff like tracking that 30% urgent need for grantees that really are trying to max that out, and they fall and tumble and all that kind of stuff. But if you have somebody on your team who can do basic formulas in Excel, that's really all you need for this. Now, if you're running a $40 million economic development program, we'll have a different conversation. But generally speaking, and right now, because under the CV funds, you don't have the aggregate requirement and you only have the individual, what I'll call enhanced requirement, it's even easier than it would usually be otherwise. All right, so it looks like we have 2 questions, one of which is silly. And I don't mean that in a bad way. It's like, does Dion take any contract work? Of course I do. I'm with TDA. So that's what I mean by silly. But the last one comes back to the beginning, right? So this is back to the beginning of the morning as a follow-up to the LMC National Objective for a Child Care Facility, right? So we're a little out of our venue, but that's okay because we're CDBGers. Do you have to create jobs, or do we meet a national objective by providing additional LMI childcare spots? We would like to encourage home childcare providers to become licensed and therefore be able to serve more than 3 children. So that's a huge need, and you can do it either way, right? So what you want to really think about is, what are you paying for? Okay. And is it going to potentially fall into your public services, which, when we get back to the real world, we'll have a cap again. So that is a consideration. If you're looking at limited clientele or low mod income clientele, you can absolutely do childcare that way, but keep in mind that you're going to be triggering the public services cap, right, which you might not want to be otherwise. If you don't want to, you can look at, remember, there's creating and retaining jobs, and then there's also the other option of providing goods or services to low and moderate income persons. Okay, so you may want to look at LMJ through that lens of goods and services as opposed to jobs created or retained. Okay. And I think with 30 seconds left, that was the last question, because we are nothing if not timely. So I gotta say, for a 6 a.m. to 8 a.m. West Coast time gig, this has been pretty fun. Deidre, thanks for hanging with me. And Jeremy, thanks for the cameo guest spot. It's always nice to have the famous people, come hang out on our show in the morning. I'll see y'all tomorrow for the fun of financial management, because what could be more fun than that? Just appreciate everybody being here, and hope
Definitely.
that you enjoyed the session this morning. And I think you will now be moving on to the joys of something else fabulous. So take a little break, grab more coffee, and make sure you get back in time for the next session.
All right. Thanks.
Thank you,
bye,
everybody.
Everyone.
Bye, Jeremy.
Bye, Jeremy.
Bye, Deidre. Thank you so much for being
Thanks,
my team member today. You're great.
Thank you. Thank you.